So I would like to go ahead and introduce our next segment, which is Regional Perspectives, a conversation on equity in practice. And I'm excited to welcome some of my colleagues from around the region and also elsewhere in the country to engage in a conversation with our guest moderator, Byrd Guest, to talk about what's going on elsewhere in the DMV to advance racial equity in local government. We have joining us today, as I mentioned, Byrd Guest, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Racial Equity Group. We have Karla Bruce, Chief Equity Officer from Fairfax County. One of our panelists, Dr. Amber Hewitt, is not with us today. And then we have Pete Hill, a consultant, and he is formerly Chief Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity Officer in Anne Arundel County. So thank you all for being here with us. I'm gonna actually sit with them as well, if you all would have me, don't mind. And so we look forward to the conversation.
All right. Well, let me just say good morning, everyone. All right. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and I'm looking forward to this conversation and being able to extract some ideas, insights, and wisdom from our panel here. So what I want to do is just say I think it's also a great replacement, Samia. I don't think there's for you to be able to come on, step in. All right. Okay. So when you think about racial equity, you think about our concept, our theme of race, I want to start off by asking our panelists here about this theory of change. There's a theory of change for this work that we do. It's 4 components: normalizing, organizing, operationalizing, as well as assessing, when you're really trying to advance and do this work, whether it's the public sector or the private sector. And so I want you all to think about what this means in your jurisdictions that you all are doing this work in. If you can give us some examples of successes, failures, challenges, and opportunities around what those mean to you. Now, for the sake of the audience, when we talk about normalizing, that's about having these conversations on race, having a shared language within your organizations about racial equity, diversity, inclusion. Organizing is about the accountability structures and the sustainability structures for making this work sustainable, not just a one-off training or an event, but really making it sustainable. Operationalizing about applying that equity lens through policies and practices. And my favorite, assessing, like how do you measure, monitor, and manage this work as well. So now that's just the 4 components, but in some jurisdictions, it may be approached a little bit differently, and it may mean something differently. So I'm going to start off with Karla to be able to share your thoughts on any one of those, or all together, your choice.
All right, thank you, Byrd, and it's good to be here to not so far away with my colleague Samia. And I'm going to start by saying, so I'm the Chief Equity Officer in Fairfax County, and being a Chief Equity Officer can be a fairly lonely job. And I'm very thankful to have Samia as a colleague, and I'm sure you all know how great she is, but let me just take this opportunity to tell you how fortunate you are to have Samia Byrd as your Chief Equity Officer for Arlington County government. We get to meet a lot of folks from across the country, and really getting to the point of using the framework fully and understanding the significance of not getting caught in any one aspect of the framework, to have a real comprehensive strategy to advance racial equity. That's what I've observed through Samia's leadership, and why I appreciate her so much as a colleague. So thank you for inviting me, Samia. But yeah, like Byrd said, I think all of us sort of have adopted this framework that's been established by the Government Alliance on Race and Equity and tweaked it a bit to serve our purpose. I would say in Fairfax County, we too have sort of 4 elements to it. The way we think about it as visioning, organizing, normalizing, organizing, and operationalizing, with the assessing sort of woven throughout. And to the extent that we started with a vision, our vision is to become one Fairfax. So in November of 2017, our Board of Supervisors and School Board adopted a policy, our One Fairfax policy. And what that policy establishes is that we will consider equity in all of our planning and decision making. And I emphasize consider. It is not we will achieve equity, we will consider equity. It'll be we will have the systems and structures in place that will enable our board and our workforce to take equity into consideration in everything that we do. And that's been what my role is in the county, is to really build the infrastructure and lead the infrastructure for achieving that vision of One Fairfax. And then we do it through the normalizing, the organizing, and the operationalizing. And I want to acknowledge that today I'm joined by a few of my One Fairfax team members who wanted to come and observe and see the great things that are happening in Arlington County. So wave your hands if you're in here somewhere. There they are. Hey.
We see y'all.
Hey, team. Hey, team. So the first part of that is really assembling a team, right? So you all, as sort of the team in Arlington County, we too in Fairfax have a team of people. To operationalize our One Fairfax policy, we have equity leads in every county department. We have a growing number of what we call dedicated equity leads. Departments have said there's something to this work, and they have actually established permanent positions in their organizations. I think we're up to about 7 now. One in the latest that's in recruitment is one in our police department. But as we move through that normalizing, organizing, operationalizing, really what we're seeing happening there's 2 things that are happening, and we sort of added these elements. Power is shifting, and the culture of the organization shifts. And it really is that power shift and that culture shift that moves us through that cycle of continually trying to better understand, what do we mean by One Fairfax? Like when we say that, the Board of Supervisors, I will continue to say, I'm not sure that they really fully understood what that would look like, but I think they, entrusted this dynamic that we had within our organization and within the community to help us to better understand what that looks like. But that power shift that's happening, not just sort of power within the organization, but the engagement of our community and so really involving the community in helping us to understand the conditions in Fairfax and what in fact is inequitable in Fairfax and what we need to change through policy and practice. And then the culture of our organization in terms of being willing to change. And you were talking earlier as we were preparing, this idea is you can't just mandate change, right? People have to understand change. People have to know the benefit, why it's good for all of us to change. So that's sort of how we've used that framework.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you, Karla. And if Samir or Pete would like to expand on that or share.
And of course, I would have to follow Karla. So again, my name is Pete Hill, and I was the very first Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer for Anne Arundel County in the great state of Maryland. When I first showed up, I had to remember that America was settled by 2 types of people, pioneers and settlers. And I had to realize rather quickly that I was a pioneer, not a settler, that I was literally blazing the trail that everyone who would come after me would have to follow. A difficult proposition at best. Luckily, I had an equal opportunity officer, Asha Smith, who replaced me as director, thank God. But she and I were a 2-person team. And we quickly realized that when it came to Noah, not that Noah, but normalizing, operationalizing, organizing, and assessing, that we needed to make sure that everyone understood what that meant. So beginning with normalizing, the first thing we wanted to normalize is, how do we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion? What are the ground rules, et cetera, et cetera? And when we say the word equity, what does that really mean? Because it often means different things to different people, depending on where they are on the org chart. When it came to operationalizing, we're talking about policies, procedures, and common practices. What are we putting in place so that we can get to the organizing piece where we're putting together structures that are going to help us implement whatever policies, procedures, or common practices that are going to help us to identify inequities and then address them appropriately. And last but not least, I had to convince them that even if we made it through the first 3 steps, that is a great start. It is not your landing spot. We need to be able to assess the things that we claim we did. And how do we communicate those assessments, both internally, the people who were doing the work, in my case, the various departments at a county level, but more importantly, to our constituents. What do we do using your tax dollars? And how will it benefit or harm you? And so keep it in mind, I came from a county that was considered a purple county. One of the first things I had to do as director, believe it or not, was to defend the fact that I even existed. Because at this time, people were questioning, are we wasting our time and efforts talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion? And of course, I made the passionate case, not the business case, as to why, yes, you do need a guy like me. Because without a guy like me, you continue what we call the status quo. And if the status quo works for you, then there's no need to change it. But if it's not working for you, you're looking for an advocate, and that would be me. Turn it over to my colleague.
I appreciate so much of what you both said. I think that GARE framework that a lot of the jurisdictions in this region and across the country actually have adopted or adapted, the assess piece wasn't part of that. It was coalescing around a vision first, and then how do you normalize, organize, operationalize? And for us, the assess piece was important because we needed to know what we were, that vision, like what were we trying to get to? What's the outcome? And trying to be centered on outcomes. I think, we were grounded in a vision that was established broadly. One of the challenges I think I recognized early on was everyone didn't know or understand the framework, what we were talking about. It was relegated to some select few who had gone to some training, and then it was put upon those people to then carry that forward and to an organization of 3,800 plus employees. So how do you communicate what we're talking about when we defined the terms, we knew what they were, we had a framework, we had a structure in place, but we did not necessarily understand or know early on how to root that enough for it to grow throughout the entire organization. And so that's been, I think, a little bit of the challenge. When I think about that framework, I think of everything comprehensively, like you were saying earlier, that it's not linear, it's not steps to a process. And I think this gets to a lot of what Dr. Clark was saying. It's a large body of work that has to be rooted, but it's all of those things are happening all at the same time.
All the time.
And continually and consistently, if we get to the piece that you're talking about, the change, the culture, the advocacy for the people who want the status quo and the people who don't, like how do you bring that whole large framework to an entire organization and root it so that they know, we all know what we are working towards, what we're normalizing, what our organizational structure will be, what we're operationalizing, and then what are we actually assessing? I think that is what that vision helps us to achieve. And I think if I'm, we're 4+ years in now, I think if I'm looking back and reflecting on where we've come using that framework, I think it would have been great to maybe do more of the visioning and also thinking about the outcomes early on, like where we're all going so that we understand when we're normalizing or organizing, operationalizing, and assessing, we know what the outcomes are that we're looking for our community and for our organization. And so, Karla and I spend a lot of time talking about the framework, the work that we're doing, and a lot of the different steps and how do we bring people along, how do we root this in the work that we're doing so that people don't continue to see this as the checkbox or performative, but we really can see that power shift that you were talking about and some of those other changes throughout the organization. I just reflected on that as I was hearing you all talk. There are a lot of things that I think about in terms of, how do we continue to evolve the work? And when I think about assess, that's what I really think about. Yes, it's the metrics, yes, it's the outcome, but this work has to continually evolve. If it's not evolving, then we're staying in the status quo.
That's right.
And we're not changing anything. We're just, again, going through the steps, because we have to as government. We're trying to check the box because we said this is what we were going to do, because we all adopted these resolutions, because board members said this is the direction we're going. But I think we all want something more than that.
That's right.
And we want to be invested in it for the long haul so that it's sustained and maintained over time. And that's why I think the framework is important, but it has to be rooted in the ultimate outcome that we're trying to achieve.
Okay, all right, thank you all for those responses. And Samia, just thinking about what you said, 3,800 employees trying to embed this mindset into an entire organization. I want to talk about that a little bit more. Because now, we think about it, there are a lot of people who say, well, when it comes to racial equity, diversity, inclusion, that's like human resources job. That's Samia's job. That's the diversity officer's job. If I work in public works, hey, I fix and repair roads and infrastructure. Or I work in the finance accounting department. I don't have to really worry about racial equity, diversity, inclusion, do I? Or do I not? And so now I want to talk about, it's very easy to have these conversations with people who get it, who maybe have the awareness and education around racial equity, diversity, inclusion. But what about people who don't understand what it is, never heard of before, and just say, hey, I was hired to do this job. Now all of a sudden you want me to do racial equity, diversity, inclusion. How have you approached that in your jurisdictions? And just tell us about that a little bit. And I'll start with Pete this time.
The way I talk about it is the same way we talk about computer security. You were not hired to keep your computer safe, but I bet you keep it safe or else. Likewise, when it comes to emotional or psychological safety, it should be no different. That when you unintentionally hurt people, you are intentionally making them feel unsafe. And so just as you don't want your computer to be unsafe for the data in which you are inputting and extracting, you should not want those human resources, we call them colleagues, employees, supervisors, co-workers. They should be equally valuable to us when it comes to safety. And so again, I don't like the business case, I make the human case as to why you should be doing the right thing. And if you can care about a piece of machinery, so much so that you have mandatory training, then surely, sir or ma'am or other, you should want to show up to voluntary training when I have lunch and learn events. I didn't even make it mandatory. But I am making the case that if you miss this information, you're doing a disservice first and foremost to yourself and to all of those who follow your leadership. And the key thing I point out about leadership is all of us are leaders in some capacity. You might not have an official title, director, etc. That just means you have some type of authority. That doesn't necessarily make you a leader. Or you may be the administrative assistant with 40 years of experience, and if you don't show up to work, the operation fails. You are a leader. So when I do training, I ask that question right off the rip: who's a leader? And the response to that question is, we all are. And so when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion propositions, I don't care what they hired you for when you went to a job interview, my friend. In order for us to be innovative, creative, effective, and efficient, I'm going to need you to have the same attitude about that computer training that you have about unconscious bias training, emotional intelligence, culture training, etc.
That was, wow. Yeah, that's good. Good. I never thought about it that way before. It's mandatory to go to like safety training. Yeah, a lot of organizations, public and private sector. But should it be mandatory for psychological safety training? That's a really good point. Thank you. Karla, what are your thoughts?
I'm just still ruminating on that point. So I'll say that we sort of approach it differently in Fairfax County, and we had a very robust conversation as we were waiting to come out on stage about the business case for equity, and that, it shouldn't be a business case, it's really the human case. I would say that one of the things that drives our commitment to equity in Fairfax County is the economic case. The population in Fairfax County, I can't even say is diversifying, has diversified significantly. The population growth is completely attributable to people of color in Fairfax County. And back in 2015, we had what we called an equitable growth profile done in partnership with PolicyLink. And it said, look, if you all don't figure this out, what's the future of Fairfax County gonna be, right? If people aren't able to live in Fairfax County to their full potential, what does that mean for you? And so while I would like to say that it was sort of the human case that drove Fairfax County's commitment to equity, it really has been the economic case. Now, I do think there's a human element to it. And I think that what we've tried to do, and our, we talked earlier about the, normalizing, organizing, operationalizing, assessing, or visioning, or whatever. One of the structures that we have in place is our countywide strategic plan, which is really saying, how is the county doing across 10 key outcome areas? If you can't take each of those 10 outcome areas and ask yourselves the question, how are different places doing? How are different populations doing? Then you're not committed to equity, right? And so it's been a long road. We've been at this strategic planning process for, I think, 4 years now. But I can see that that's really where we're starting to embed a real focus on the metrics around advancing equity. And that's where it connects to people's jobs. So one of the things I have actually avoided in the county is sort of broad countywide equity training. Because what I want to do is introduce an equity analysis. I want people to understand how to think about the area of expertise that they're in. I don't know every aspect of the government. I'm not an expert in libraries. I'm not an expert in public works. I'm not an expert in policing. But what I can do is help you think about your technical area of expertise from an equity perspective in relation to how we're doing as a county. And I think that's what we're trying to do, and emphasize trying. I am not saying that we've done it. We're working on this. Is we're trying to help people to understand that as public servants, we want success for the jurisdiction that we work in and the people in that community, right? We play a role in that. So that's the commitment. How can we say we're successful if all people aren't successful, all places aren't successful? So that's where we introduce the equity perspective. And then working to provide the appropriate level of training at the appropriate level, training focused on, leadership, training focused on those folks that we refer to as our equity leads, and then training eventually focused on people who are at the so-called ground level who are just operationalizing this. And I will say for some folks, they don't even know that we're talking about equity, right? To be honest, right? They're just doing their jobs, but they're doing it in a way and supported within their organizations to understand that success means success for all people and success for all places, and that we're introducing targeted strategy. What they're doing is really focused on targeted strategy. So, again, I think I've had so many debates about sort of how we are approaching this. We need countywide training about equity. And what I'm trying to do is I want people to make this a part of their job. Whether or not they say equity, what they do is that they understand that their definition of success is all people in all places should have what they need, targeted strategy to achieve success as we define it for the county. That's the goal that we're looking to achieve in terms of the organizational embrace of equity.
Okay, well said, yeah. Very well said. So in other words, not just doing something special for certain groups of people in the community, just really making sure that we are effectively serving all stakeholders within a community. We don't have to call it that. We just call it, are we effective in our county
delivery,
operations?
yeah,
Absolutely.
we're public servants.
right.
At the end of the day, we're public servants.
All right, thank you, Karla. Samir, any thoughts?
I think our strategy has been somewhat of a hybrid of what you've both talked about. So the idea that, we want to be able to focus our strategies for people working in different areas, very specific to their line of business, is important. And so we've tried to, I think, for Arlington, going back to that framework, utilize all of those pieces to establish how people can get to understand what the targeted strategy should be when they're talking about advancing racial equity in their line of business. But that can't necessarily happen if they don't have the equity mindset too. So for a while there, we were in a place where people were like, well, just give us the tool. Just tell us what to do and we'll do it. But it's not that easy, because if you don't have the mindset that goes with that, if you haven't had any conversations about racial equity, and you haven't normalized, and you've not been normalizing, and you're not at an understanding of what it means for you and why you do the things you do as a public servant, then the tool is not going to be successful, because then it does become performative and checkbox, and you're not really changing any outcomes, which again, I'm going back to outcomes. At the end of the day, we're trying to change outcomes for people, and we're also trying to change our culture and our behavior. And so we've taken the approach of, yes, there is mandatory countywide training around racial equity, but we've tried to break it down into specific areas of focus that will go along with how people do their work. So it's, what is race? What is racism? What are the different types of racism? Some of those basics. Then what are the tools that we use? How do we apply those tools to our work? And we're going through a journey so that people will have the tools, but they'll also have the understanding as their foundation. And we want people to be rooted in that. And so I think it's really important to, yes, training is important because that's how we normalize. So having the conversations, making sure that everybody's engaged. One of the things that started us on the journey of this work was our social determinants of health and health equity. People understood that in the community when they understood that the areas that we service, certain areas, your zip code meant you had a 10-year difference in your life expectancy. People understood that. And then they can apply that to, what does that mean for our work? That's how we got to our equity resolution and working with our Department of Human Services and the work that they were doing around health equity. But trying to make it tangible for people. And that only happens, even in the workspace, the tangibility only happens if people understand the why, going back to that human case, to understand the why of what they're doing, and then how does that relate to my job? So we've been trying to bridge those two in a more comprehensive kind of approach to it, as opposed to saying we start here, then we go there, then we go there. No, we got to do all of it at the same time. So that's kind of been our approach.
Okay, all right. Regardless of the great tools that an organization may have to advance this work, or training as well, training all employees, whether it's mandatory or just making it voluntary, but encouraging it and showing how it can benefit all residents of a county, as well as internal and external stakeholders. Let's talk about the role of leadership in advancing this work as well. And I guess looking at leadership as what role do they play in trying to advance this work. So just take it to a higher level. We got all employees, but just looking specifically in people who are in leadership positions, who have influence, power, authority to either make or break this type of work, or just keep it, as Pete would say, status quo. So let's talk about your views and thoughts on leadership's role in this work. And you can even talk about what you've seen be effective or ineffective as it relates to that. Who'd ever like to kick us off?
I'll say this work doesn't happen without leadership, period. Whether that's elected, whether that's senior leadership, it doesn't happen without leadership. Government spaces, and we all know it is a system, it's an institution. We all work through hierarchies. We understand the structure, for better or for worse. it does not happen without leadership being out front, being engaged, being vocal, encouraging, and then also leading by example, modeling and demonstrating the commitment to it through the way they hold meetings, through the discussions that they have on the topic, through making sure that the things that we are putting forward are being implemented and completed by employees, holding people accountable, the accountability factor. One of the things that was important for us early on, I remember what some of the early conversations that we had, Mark said, he said to all senior leaders, okay, so what are you gonna do about equity? And then that, everybody started thinking about the work and how they were gonna bring it to their departments. Again, it had to start with the leadership holding people that have the power, have the authority, who are in charge, being accountable to making sure we are doing what we have been directed and called to do through the resolution and things of that nature. And so I think it's important for if we want all employees to be engaged and do the work, they have to see leadership doing it. Mm-hmm. They have to see leadership out front. And it can't just be do it because I said, but they also want to see that you're doing it too and that you're committed to it. So how are you modeling what you are indeed asking others to do? I had an opportunity to remind county board members, use the equity lens. It's your equity lens. This is something that we're supposed to be bringing forward. So as you're considering decisions and the work that we're bringing forward, make sure that you're applying the questions as well to the decisions that you're making. So it just has to be, they're a very critical part of the work, and they have to be seen doing the work as well.
Okay, thank you, Samia.
Well, I'll hop in here. I mean, enough said with what Samia said. I ditto that completely. I will say that when we adopted our One Fairfax policy, we intentionally, while I think it was the energy started with a group of staff, like you said, this goes nowhere without the full commitment of leadership. And so we talk about it as sort of the collective leadership, the leadership of our elected officials, but also our executives as well. In terms of sort of, I think the two sort of spaces where I think leaders are sort of exercising their leadership. So from the board's perspective, that's really an equity advancing policy agenda. So what are they? What change do they want to see? So we've made it evident what the inequities are in Fairfax County. What policies do they want to see related to housing, related to economic opportunity? That they're going to set their vision of what they want to see, and that's critically important. In many cases, that's driven by the community, right? The community is telling them what they want to see, and then they're telling us what they want to see, and we're really operationalizing it. I would say within the organization, though, in terms of the executives, it can be a challenge, right? Because they're in many ways kind of just, keeping the ship sailing, right? And in many cases, not sort of stepping out and being the sort of visionary leader that you would want and the one that's necessary in terms of advancing equity. So I do a lot of one-on-one consultation with our executive leaders. What's been helpful for me is the positioning of this work in our organization. I report to the county executive and sit in his office, which gives me that whole of government sort of focus and authority to step in, exercise my leadership when I need to, but also to be sort of in a space where I can, I am respected, that this work is respected as a leadership consideration. I think that, as Pete was saying earlier, leadership happens at all levels, and I think that it's important that people sort of use their role in the organizations to do what they can. But if we don't acknowledge that we need both the elected and the executive leadership moving in the direction of advancing equity, then we're really not going to get anywhere. So,
Thank you, Karla.
I come to this whole approach about what is the role of leadership based on my experiences with leadership. I spent 22 years in the United States Army who harped on a daily basis the importance of leadership. The leaders, they said, were always on display. That the things you did or failed to do will dictate what behavior you are modeling either intentionally or unintentionally. That what gets done or fails to get done will be because of your actions, leadership. I was further told that we are all leaders in some capacity or another. That a private may go into a war with little responsibility, but because of attrition, think enemy bullets, you may go from private to battlefield lieutenant in the blink of an eye. Likewise, you could be a mid-level manager today, do something wrong, and be fired tomorrow, and the person that was beneath you, who you failed to train, I might add, because you didn't think in a forward manner, now they find themselves in your position with little or no training. There was an article that came out in 2014 in Forbes magazine that said the following: on average, it takes about a decade for a person to be promoted and then go to official training. That for 10 years, you know what you're leaning on? How the leaders that you work for treated you. God help us all if you work for a bully. Because that will be, my friend, the behavior you will begin to model. Why am I telling you this? Because I believe, without a doubt, that leadership is inextricably linked to equity, diversity, and inclusion. But who's a leader? We all are. And so we make a critical mistake when we place the importance of EDI on one person, the so-called department head, the leader of the agency. No, if we all do a little, nobody has to do a lot. We need to share the burden. So the catastrophic mistake we make in this field is assuming one person is responsible for the outcome. That one person may be a person like the lot of us on the stage, or it may be the head of the agency. But the point I'm making is all of us. And if we don't embrace that sooner rather than later, we will continue with the status quo. And so again, for me, leadership is critically important, but the more important question is, who's the damn leader? And that would be you. Stephen Covey said, and I will be quiet after this, begin with the end in mind. If you begin thinking the other guy's responsible, we know what the end in mind looks like. But if you begin with thinking, I am responsible for this outcome as much as her, him, and you. If everybody does a little, nobody has to do a lot. EDI typically fails because you put that huge burden on one person. If they interview people like us on this stage after we have been frustrated for 18 months or so, we typically say the same thing. I was burned out because I was not supported, because everybody was counting on me to undo 400 years of dissatisfaction. One person. And then they wonder why I left that job.
All right, thank you, Pete. Oh. Yes, Samia.
So this is a conversation that we have a lot. And when we started thinking about a position for racial equity, we had very clear conversations about this not being one person's job. And that was some of the hesitancy, I think, and for some people in the community and elsewhere, advocates, like for 2 years, we talked about a position, but we were like, we're not going to have one because we didn't want it to end up being that it was going to fall on one person. And even when we're in these roles, sometimes despite, this is everybody's work. I think you all have heard me say that. We all need to have an equity mindset. It's not just me, it's all of us. And even still, people being people, we end up in these places where the person that has the title or the position ends up being the one who is seen as, well, it's your job. Well, you have to do it. And in some respects makes other people feel like they can't be leaders, or that they also don't need to be accountable for doing the work. And that's just not, the reality, even, to our best efforts, continuing to try to make sure it's everyone's work. It still ends up, if there's a title, because that's just how we're conditioned to think, there's a title associated with it and a person who sits at a high level, then, oh yeah, they're gonna handle it, it's their job.
All right, thank you, Samia. Okay, so let's get to some deeper questions as well that are really gonna provoke us a little bit more, our thoughts. As you all know, there's been some backlash, political backlash, primarily I'm thinking right after the Supreme Court ruled against affirmative action. You also started seeing organizations being developed and now are suing and challenging companies like Starbucks, Target, investment companies, all about their diversity, equity, inclusion policies as being now considered unconstitutional. So there's this lot of just seems like ambush as it relates to racial equity, diversity, inclusion that is taking place right now as we speak, where we're questioning whether or not you're being fair to everyone. So, and I see a lot of that in the private sector, and we know what usually happens in the private sector is usually gonna filter over or simultaneously happen with the public sector as well. So talk to us about just, I guess, thoughts on or approaches, or have you experienced that so far? People questioning and saying, hey, is this really the right thing to do? Because it seems like you're, some people say it's reverse discrimination, it seems like it, or it seems like you're focusing just on, people who are Black or Hispanic, or people who are just maybe with disabilities. And it seems like you're just focusing on just groups and you're giving them special treatment and favor, and that goes against our Constitution. So talk to us about just this uproar, especially really after the Supreme Court decision against affirmative action. Karla, I'll start with you.
I was going to say, I'll start with Pete.
All right.
Because I know, I got a sense I know what he's going with it. But I will just say, Arlington and Fairfax, we can find ourselves living in a bubble and not experiencing this in the same way that we see on the news, right? But rest assured, we're experiencing it. It's just showing up in different ways. It's showing up as, concerns about density. It's showing up as concerns about too much traffic. But it's showing up, right? And so I think that what I would say before I turn it over to Pete to say something brilliant is that we have to have our eyes tuned to what it looks like uniquely here, and not be, and also realize the who, because sometimes the who is deceptive. I mean, it's the people that we often see that we would believe are on our side, right? And so, I think it's really important for us in this area to be mindful and to not sort of say, oh, good thing that's not happening here right now. It's happening here. And the folks that are seeking to undermine the work are often the people that we would consider allies. So I'll just leave it at that.
Good point. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And I'm going to turn it to you, Pete, to say something brilliant.
So I don't know if I'm going to say something brilliant, but it would most certainly be brilliant adjacent. How about that? My friends, here's what I would say about that. How many of you have discovered what happens when you fail to prepare? Am I the only one who failed to prepare and was shocked, I tell you, when things did not go according to plan? Anybody else? Mm-hmm. As practitioners, we must prepare for resistance. Because remember, people don't resist change, they resist being changed. And what is EDI if nothing but change? Because it is changing the status quo. By definition, everything we do in this field is about challenging the status quo, change. So when it comes to that resistance, you don't want to become a barrier yourself. When I first got into this field back in 1992, I'm dating myself, but I got a Hey You mission in the Army. Hey you, young sergeant, none of the senior sergeants want to go to this training, so you're going. And I was highly upset, I must tell you, until I got there and discovered it was the best training I would ever attend. And I've been doing it ever since. Here's the point. In that training, they taught us to be prepared for resistance because you're challenging people's culture. The good sergeant teaching that class asked us, what are the first 4 letters in the word culture? Do you know? Say it with me.
Cult.
Each of us grew up in a cult, whether we want to believe it or not. We have been indoctrinated from age 1 to approximately 14 when we began to question those around us. He then said to us, if you think for 1 second, people who were raised in a cult, and that would be all of you, are going to take it lying down that you're telling them the things that they have been taught to value, believe, how to behave, and what viewpoints to have, you are challenging those things. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to question what you're saying because it does not represent what they've been taught. They are experiencing cognitive dissonance. And it is your job now to help them to get right, to understand why this change is necessary. In 1948, Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981. It was a simple statement. I hereby integrate the entire Department of Defense, effective immediately. That was in 1948. The change did not occur until 1952. Why am I telling you that story? Remember I said that leadership was inextricably linked to DEI or EDI? Mid-level managers are some of the biggest barriers to changing the status quo. You see how these 2 people are nodding their heads up and down on my left and right? That's typically what it looks like when I'm talking to senior executives. They get it. It's that man or woman or whoever it is that's in mid-level management that's not in this meeting who's going to be told later on what you're getting ready to do and you don't have a choice in the matter. They're going to lean on the only thing they're familiar with, the cult. You call it culture. What did they believe growing up? What did they value? How did it teach them to behave? And what viewpoints do they have? If as a practitioner, you don't take all of these things into consideration, you, my friend, then become a part of the problem, not the solution. How dare we think that just because we sounded intelligent while making the case, that the audience automatically said, woohoo, let's do it. There will be resistance. We need to prepare for it and have a response. Otherwise, we look incompetent when somebody say, but why? Remember when your parents would just say, because I told you to? How did you respond? It will be no different for that person in the workplace.
All right, thank you.
Brilliant.
How are we doing on time, I guess? Are we,
So as the timekeeper as well, we are short.
just want to make sure.
We are short on time, but if
Okay.
we want to wrap it up and open it up, we can for one or two
Yes,
questions.
no, that's interesting. And it's interesting that when Pete talks about with the military, it's interesting also when you look at the Supreme Court decision, which was really related to an educational domain. But if you go back, which I highly encourage you all to do, look, you can, the Supreme Court hearing about the case for diversity, equity, inclusion at these schools, Harvard and University of North Carolina, you can see the discourse between the attorneys and the Supreme Court justices about, why does diversity matter? Why does it matter if I sit in a classroom? What's the benefit of me sitting in a classroom with people who are just all different? So we have to really, we can kind of really think about it. We ask yourselves, hey, what's the benefit of, we do know that there's groupthink. There's a lot of times if people are in a meeting and if it's everybody who looks like you, got the same background as you, same education level as you, you might have some blind spots. You would kind of think that intuitively, but a lot of times goes back to what Pete said. It's kind of how some people, it's part of that cult. It's what they've always seen as being normal. But one thing about the Supreme Court decisions in the hearings is you can really understand the thought processes for a lot of the justices for understanding that in their case as well. But also, what was interesting is that we're going to make this just for colleges. It's okay if the military colleges continue to have affirmative action. Why do y'all think that was? Pete, and I'll start with you, the military. Why is it okay just, well, these colleges, we don't want DI, there's really no value here. But when it comes to the military, we're going to say leave it in place. Pete, real quick.
It's not that Bird thinks I'm a genius on that subject. It happens to be that he and I had this conversation prior to coming to this panel, right? And I mentioned to Bird that, Bird, one of the reasons why the military takes equity, diversity, and inclusion so seriously is because during the Vietnam War, we almost lost that war based on racism. Many people don't know that when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, there was a lot of Confederate flags being waved in the middle of a war zone, mind you. We had this type of discourse between two races. It was so bad that the Vietnamese or the Viet Cong were dropping flyers talking to the black soldiers saying, why are you fighting this war when you are not even free back home? So the Department of Defense noticed that and said, hey, this is a national defense issue. We need to take equity, diversity, and inclusion deadly serious. So to this very day, every officer, every NCO are indoctrinated with the necessity of having equity, diversity, and inclusion on the battlefield. How many of you want your soldiers, airmen, sailors, or Marines fighting amongst themselves as the enemy is trying to attack us? What do you think that would look like? The last thing I want to point out, Bertie, you didn't ask this question, but it's connected. And that is, when it comes to diversity, for those who don't believe in it, how many of you wear the same clothes every day without change? You wear the same shoes, same underwear. You just don't believe in diversity. Well, the question becomes, why do you believe in diversities in certain facets of your life, but not in others? And I would argue, cult. What did you grow up valuing, believing, what taught you how to behave, and taught you what your viewpoints are? Remember, and I don't know who said this, but it sounded brilliant when I heard it. We don't see the world the way it is. We see the world the way we are. How are we is the question.
Thank you, Pete. Yeah. Okay. Just last thoughts, I would say. Well, I don't necessarily have a question, but Samia, Karla, just last thoughts regarding just the success of this work and what we need to really think about going forward, is whether it's preparing, as Pete said, but yeah, just as last thoughts, Samia, Karla, who wants to go?
Well, I'll start and we can close, Samia. I think, again, things like today's occasion, I think, are really important to, take a pause and share space with folks you don't typically work with, hear from folks you don't typically hear from. I think, if we're going to be successful, we talked about it before, it's sort of holding that, we need sort of the people that are leadership in name, but then we also need all of us to sort of assume the leadership role within our organization and do what we can. I do think that, sort of, we have to think about what does success look like, right? And I think Samia used the term earlier about this is evolving, right? And so it's not, we have this dashboard and we hit all the measures, because I feel like we are at a point where we can make this very performative, right? We're using tools, we're putting up data, we're doing all these things that make us think we're doing the work. But how much of it has really gotten embedded in just our understanding of what our work is? Because if it can be embedded in our understanding of what our work is, then we're constantly sort of working and striving toward this sort of nebulous concept of equity. So I think, we have to hold ourselves accountable to not get caught up in doing, just those performative things, but in the, that sort of the day-to-day understanding of what success looks like and what we as individuals contribute to that success.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Karla. Great point. Yep. Which actually got me thinking now, Samia, about what Karla had mentioned, because one of the things that I keep taking this back to the Supreme Court discourses where they said, well, when is this going to end? Like, if we do keep it from that, like, is there an end point to it? How do we know kind of when we get there? Because otherwise, if there's no end to it, which that's one of the reasons why, then we need to go ahead and just make it unconstitutional now. Samia, what should we be looking for if we have all this data, these dashboards, these metrics? I guess, how do we know if we're making progress, and what's the end point, or if there is an end point?
So I don't know that there's an end point that we will see in our lifetimes, but for me, and something I was thinking about, Karla, when you were speaking, is focusing on the outcome and what that vision is that we have. All are valued, educated, healthy, and safe, regardless of race. When we start to see that the conversations, the tools, all of those things are starting to lead to those outcomes, then we don't stop. We just keep going to make sure that it continues to be sustained. Mm-hmm. So embedding it, right? For us, it's making sure that we're continually providing people the opportunities to develop an equity mindset so that it just becomes a part of who they are, what they do. It's embodied, and it's embodied in the organization. So one of the things that I really have been trying to focus on is making sure that this work is institutionalized. I heard somebody say not too long ago, the institution does what the institution is going to do. It always will. But we have the opportunity, being within the institution, to change it from within. It's a very hard thing to do, because we have to keep the institution running, right? It continues to move, whether we do anything or not. But we have to also be willing to use our equity mindset, continue to develop it so that while we're in the system, while we're in the institution, we're changing it from the inside out to bring about those outcomes that we want to see in our community and for ourselves. So it's not just for the community, but for the employees as well. So, how do we continually evolve it and perpetuate it in a new way so that it is maintained beyond any of us? And I think that is, where we're that's what it looks like. That's what we're going to, so that whoever comes behind us is doing it, and the person coming behind them is doing it, because we don't want it to stop.
That's right.
If it stops, we go back to what we have now.
That's it.
And that's not
right.
working.
That's it.
That's right.
Thank you. I wanted to say thank you to all the panelists up here. I've enjoyed asking you all these questions and getting these ideas and insights. And Pete, I'll never think of computer training the same way again. Love that. Or safety training in my mind. So can we give all our panelists another huge round of applause? Good job.